So another paper about ratings, and I was going to ask my wife to be my timer, but I was afraid there might be a bias. I'm not sure which way, but there might be a bias if I did that. And so Don, whom I've never met before, is going to do the timing. Another paper about ratings, and I hope people have been paying attention to how important numbers are, and the focus on ratings. Are we tasting the same thing, wine ratings as hedonic scaling, individual differences and magnitude matching as framing? This is a paper that tries to bridge, I consider it, I guess, interdisciplinary. It tries to bridge economics, as I think of it, narrowly defined, and psychology. And the idea of hedonic, we've heard talk about hedonic this morning. Hedonic in the psychological sense, hedonic scales that psychologists use. I see Dom Cicchetti is here, and I told him that I was going to do this. I think of wine ratings as a Gordian knot. I think Dom and his brother got it right. The Gordian knot of wine ratings, especially since advertising, as a consumer, I think advertising promotes inter-individual comparison, that we are supposed to look at ratings and in effect apply them to ourselves and say, well, if that wine is rated higher, I should buy it, or if it's rated higher, I should pay more for it, and so forth. I'm going to argue that ratings are simply an example of psychophysical scaling. It's a psychological term. Psychophysical scaling, called an hedonic or like-dislike index. It is an ordinal and not a cardinal scale, which is very important for the econometrics of this. And I will not talk about the econometrics, but it's important to bear in mind this idea of an hedonic scale as an ordinal scale, ranking, but not having the cardinal quality like something like milliliters in a bottle or something. The idea of using ratings to guide own willingness to pay amounts to comparing, this is a quote from some of the psychologists I've been reading, comparing shared experiences directly with a stranger, and I think it's likely unreliable. The critique of hedonic indices, especially their failure at inter-individual comparison, and there's a concept called magnitude matching to frame hedonic response. It's a conceptual advance over naive comparison that's going on in psychology. The focus here is really on, you'll see two things, assuming I get through all this, you'll see two things. One is that there's an issue about inter-individual comparison, a serious problem of inter-individual comparison when I'm, in effect, comparing myself to Robert Parker and saying, well, if Parker likes it, I like it. The magnitude matching gives us a measure of the problem of individual differences. I'm not so sanguine about the reliability of magnitude matching as showing how different people are. I'm more confident that it says we're different and it's difficult to compare ourselves and use someone else's ratings to guide our shopping. One other thing I'll mention is that I think in the econometric studies, I would distinguish between the role of ratings as for pricing. Many of the studies that Don cited, the role of ratings for pricing as indicating perhaps the investment value of wine or people who are buying wine to impress others, as opposed to a reflection that if this wine has a higher rating, I'm going to enjoy it more. I think those are different reasons for paying higher prices for better rated wine. One of my favorite quotes from Richard Quant, some of you see me use this before, but it captures the consumer, as far as I'm concerned, the consumer's problem. We, the wine drinking public, are happy to read their evaluations because we are largely ignorant of the quality of wines. While we can always take refuge in consulting vintage charts, we cannot possibly know whether this or that specific wine has aged better than average if old or mature, or more satisfactorily if young. So if we implicitly invite wine writers to bombard us with evaluations, and we avidly peruse these gems of prose, hoping to be informed, edified, and eager to part with our money. These are what I consider the dimensions of what I call the consumer's problem. There's a philosophical question. What does it mean to know something, and how can we know a wine or tell someone else what to know? A practical question, is the wine market smaller because of this problem? The consumers, we've heard about the difficulty of wine ratings and understanding wine. How much smaller is the market because of that? And an economic question, what determines willingness to pay for wine? Don has corrected my number. It's not 50 plus, it's probably 60 plus published articles on the subject that consider ratings. This is probably a familiar to many of you hedonic scale, the Natick 9-point scale, like extremely, dislike extremely. Basically what I'm arguing is wine ratings are the same thing conceptually. And there's an example. On the left is the Natick scale, a 9-point scale, and on the right is Parker. And basically what Parker's saying, he likes extremely or he dislikes extremely. And two kinds of comparisons are important. One I'm not going to talk about much. One, that is intra-individual comparison. This is one of the major problems with ratings. That is the lack of replication and validation. That we don't go back to the experts and say, do this again and make sure you're right. So the focus of this talk is inter-individual comparison between individuals. Professor Lim is a psychologist who studies psychophysical scaling. Basically says, due to its inequality of scale intervals and the lack of a common 0 point, the hedonic scale can yield only ordinal or best interval data. Thus, the scale cannot provide meaningful comparisons of hedonic perception between individuals. And the note at the bottom is more of an econometric problem. I'm not sure I want to get into an argument with econometricians today, but I'm noting that. Thinking about comparisons, inter-individual comparison, really the focus. One role of wine ratings to allow individual comparison. The rater's response to a wine's sensory signals informs consumers' expected responses. If we are all alike, then our hedonic responses will duplicate the rater's responses. And we would see this kind of relation of everyone agrees it's a 91. Parker says it's a 91. I'm just like Parker. It's a 91. Okay. If we're not alike, if we're different, and we sort individuals by some distinguishing characteristic. For example, in order of increasing taste sensitivity toward a pleasant taste, a sensory measure. This is important. The difference between a sensory measure, intensity of something, intensity of sweetness, intensity of salinity, which is not a hedonic measure, which is pleasure, like or dislike. We use a common non-food scale, and I'll try to explain that later, for imagining like-dislike, hedonic limits, then we might see more sensitive tasters deriving relatively more pleasure. So, I'll read my numbers. The least sensitive in this group rates something pleasurable like wine or food as a 61. The most sensitive taster rates it as a 97. These are examples of other kinds of differences where we might find the kind of graph that I just showed you. As you rate people by gender, by age, line them up by gender, age, you might get differences as opposed to the previous idea of tasting sensitivity. I've also wondered about this cultural differences, and again we can talk about this some other time I guess, but whether the Guy de Chet, for example, really speaks to French wine consumers and not to others, and the Gambero Rosso speaks to Italians and not to others, and somebody speaks to Americans and not to others. But that's just another source of differences. How is it reasonable for the consumer to assume that the expert system, scaling, mimics her own? Food scientist Linda Bartoshuk, who's important in this my research, states the problem clearly. We cannot share experiences, so we cannot compare perceived sensations directly, which I think is what we do when we use ratings. Really? Fine, give me. Can we talk? So here's what Bartoshuk did. This is what magnitude matching it. You have two groups. The first group, and the idea of framing is important here. The first group is asked to measure responses to provide an indication, a scale of responses to some non-food, strongest imaginable dislike of any kind, -100 to 100, hedonic general labeled magnitude scale, GLMS. And intensity of sensation, so that's how salty is something, how sweet, responses relative to no sensation, strongest imaginable. So the idea is here you want the rater, could be a consumer, to scale from most pleasurable to least pleasurable imaginable, not food, or no sensation, greatest sensation imaginable, something else. Group B uses the traditional 9-point scale. Okay? A and B members then rate their most like, least like food on hedonic and intensity of taste of 4 flavors. Okay? The A members who have they're imagining this sort of fundamental scale of best to worst. The A members show most least range varies directly with sensory differences. The range of like-dislike of favorite food varies directly with taste sensitivity. The B members, using the 9-point scale, rate their favorite food as a 9 and their least favorite as a 1. I think it'll become clearer when I show you the next graph. These are some of Bartoshuk's results. On the left are the A members. So you have people, if you look at the left scale, it's in effect, well, if you look at the left scale, it's basically how much you like something, your favorite food, and it goes from -100 to plus 100. And the left graph shows from 0 to 100 in taste sensitivity. You see a strong correlation between how much you like your favorite food and how sensitive your taste is. On the right, I hate the English-French problem here. On the right left scale, you're showing how much you dislike, depending on how sensitive your taste is, how much you dislike your most disliked food. Okay? Okay. On the right is the traditional 9-point scale. Okay? And basically there's no correlation between how much you enjoy something and your sensitivity to taste, either for your favorite food or your least favorite food. That's basically an explanation. I'll put it up there for 3 seconds so you can read what I just told you. The middle point is the most important. Range of like-dislike varies directly with sensory intensity. Different ranges of scores for different individuals experience flavor differently. This is another example where you see the least favorite, most favorite. And basically what you're looking at is this range of like-dislike. It's like saying, in some universal scale, the most sensitive people are rating from 97 to 61, and the least sensitive people are rating from 82 to 68. Much narrower, much wider. And the same result for the traditional scale. Implications for using ratings. Generally, we neither know nor share another frame of reference. We cannot simply compare our liking, disliking with the raters. I'm going to skip. Oh, well, this is the third point. Findings of ratings, pricing correlations are difficult to interpret, perhaps an effect from consumers who buy based upon ratings, available and good investment strategy, and not own enjoyment, unless points equal enjoyment. Research directions we can talk about, but basically I think we ought to be checking whether these people can replicate their scores. And inter-individual, I'd like to see experiments where we see if consumers can actually match scores with wines, and that's a very difficult thing to imagine how to set up that experiment. I see Eric in the audience. I don't know how you do it, but it'd be interesting to see if consumers could do it. I'm going to skip so summary and conclusions. Thanks for your mercy, Don. Most consumer learning about fine wines with which they have little or no experience comes from ratings and tasting notes. Beyond the questionable logical structure, which is a whole other paper, research on inter-individual comparisons casts further doubt upon their value. I'm going to skip to Dom's point. Gordian knot remains tied. Thank you. Merci.